My colleague, Senator Hirono from Hawaii, I very much appreciate the letting me jump ahead there. You know, in Alaska and Hawaii, we have a lot invested in this, as you know, Admiral, given that our citizens are going to be impacted sooner than anyone else with regard to the intercontinental ballistic missile threat. Just want to begin by thanking you again for your service, Admiral. Would you agree that we're clearly in a more direct threat phase with regard to the North Korean challenge to our citizens?
I agree, Senator.
And, you know, we were all over at the White House describing a strategy, integrated strategy that the administration is putting together with regard to very focused initially on enhanced diplomacy. But do you also believe that the threat of military force, or at least keeping it on the table, actually enhances our diplomatic efforts?
It does. I believe that the best enhancement to diplomacy is a strong military capability.
You mentioned the unprecedented weapons testing. I have a chart that I want you to take a look at, and also not if, but when North Korea will have a capacity to range the continental United States. So again, Hawaii and Alaska would be ranged earlier with the ICBM. The chart shows that Kim Jong-un has actually conducted more tests than his father and grandfather combined. Do you see that abating at all?
I do not see it abating at all if the trajectory remains as you have depicted on the graphic.
And he's learning even when he fails.
Right. Yeah, he is not afraid to fail in public.
So one thing, just for my colleagues here, we're going to be working on a bipartisan enhanced missile defense, homeland missile defense bill, and I certainly think that that's in order, and hopefully we'll be able to get a number of members on this committee to be co-sponsors of that. Admiral, I next want to turn to the South China Sea and the issue of freedom of navigation operations. Earlier, you had mentioned that the high-level assurances that the Chinese weren't doing that. Standing next to the President in the Rose Garden, President Xi stated, quote, "China does not intend to pursue the militarization of these islands." So what do you make of that statement by the President of China?
I wanted to believe him.
But
they have
do you believe it? Since he made that, I think it was a year and a half ago, what's happened?
They have militarized the South China Sea, sir.
So despite the fact that the President was standing next to our President, that was not an accurate statement.
The reality is that China has militarized the South China Sea. And I think you have I have a, maybe it's the other graphic, but if you look at a graphic of Fiery Cross Reef, you'll see a 10,000-foot runway, weapons emplacements, fighter aircraft hangars, and barracks for troops. Clearly, that facility, which is 700 acres, a military facility, all of that capability does not exist to rescue the odd fisherman that gets lost out there.
Yeah. This committee, as you know, has been very interested in our policies and execution with regard to freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. The Trump administration is developing its own policies. I was supportive of Secretary Carter's pronouncements of flying, sailing, and operating anywhere international law allows, but the execution of that was done rather meekly. Could you give us a sense, as the new administration is developing these policies, what principles they should be looking at, the important role of whether we're doing it under innocent passage or not, and also when you look at this last graph, this last chart, you see that the Scarborough Shoal has not been militarized yet, but it's very strategic. And what would happen if that became militarized by China? And what should we do to stop that militarization? Should we draw a red line at that important geographic point in the South China Sea? Just give us a sense on those issues, innocent passage, allies, Scarborough Shoal, what we should be looking at, what the new Trump administration should be looking at in terms of their FONOPS policy in the South China Sea.
So, Senator, I've made clear to this committee and other testimonies to other committees that I'm a supporter of freedom of navigation operations. And I think we should do them not to send a signal about territoriality or sovereignty or anything like that. We should send a signal that we do, in fact, fly, sail, or operate wherever international law allows. And the freedom of navigation operations exists just for that reason, to exercise our freedom of navigation. And the freedom of navigation that's exercised or could be exercised by all countries in the world. So one of the beneficiaries of our freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea would be China, for example, in other waters. And that's the right of all nations to operate in accordance with international law. So I believe we should continue to do those. There's a whole range of them, whether you challenge what is considered an illegal baseline claim, whether you do innocent passage and don't notify a country who maintains that you must notify them before you do an innocent passage, or you can go within a 12-mile territorial limit of an island or feature or whatever that doesn't deserve one under international law. So there's any number of ways to conduct freedom of navigation operations, and we should not limit ourselves to any of those. With regard to Scarborough Shoal, I think it's an important part of this region for the reasons depicted on that chart. It would give China a quote-unquote trifecta of bases in the South China Sea, with Woody Island, the Paracels to the northwest, the Spratlys, and their 7 bases there to the south, and then Scarborough Shoal would give them a key base in the northeast. They have not done that yet. I hesitate to draw red lines. I think red lines are problematic for a number of reasons, but we should communicate clearly with China that we do not want them to militarize, to reclaim and then militarize Scarborough Shoal.
Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On behalf of Chairman